This video is on triangle congruence. This is a review of the triangle congruence theorems that you discovered in the activities. The first one that you saw was called SSS, or side, side, side. It says that if three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. Recall that congruent means that they have exactly the same size and shape. And here's an example of that with a picture. Second one you took a look at was SAS, or side, angle, side. If two sides and the included angle of one triangle are congruent to two sides and the included angle of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. And as you can see in the picture here, the diagram here, that these two sides are congruent to each other, these two sides are congruent to each other, and this angle that's in between those two sides, that is the included angles, are congruent to each other. Another was called ASA, angle, side, angle. And that says that if two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the included side of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. So here we have this angle is congruent to this angle, a second angle is congruent in the two triangles, and then the included side of the triangles are congruent to each other. In other words, the side that is between those two congruent angles. And the last one you saw was AAS, angle, angle, side. If two angles and the non-included side of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding two angles and the non-included side of another triangle, then the two triangles are congruent. So here we have two angles of this first triangle are congruent to two angles of the second triangle, and then the corresponding sides are congruent to each other, and that would be angle, angle, side. Now you also discovered that there are two triangle congruence theorems, supposedly, that do not work. So we really can't call them theorems. And that was side, side, angle. Let's take a look at a picture here. While both of these triangles have two corresponding sides and a congruent non-included angle, you can see that another non-congruent triangle can be formed that meets the same criteria. So it's a little hard to see in the picture here, but this angle is congruent to this angle. This side is congruent to this side, and this side is actually the same length as this side, but you could also kind of swing that side out. Over here, it stays the same length, but it creates a triangle that is not congruent to the first one. So, if two sides and a non-included angle of one triangle are congruent to two sides and a non-included angle of another triangle, then the triangles are not necessarily congruent to each other. They could be, but realize that a third triangle could actually be drawn that's not congruent to the first one. So that means that SSA cannot be used as a proof of triangle congruence. The other one that you saw was AAA, or angle, angle, angle. And you can see from the picture here that while both triangles have all three corresponding angles congruent to each other, clearly these are not two congruent triangles. One is clearly larger than the other. So we do have three corresponding congruent angles, but we cannot say that those triangles are necessarily congruent to each other. So AAA cannot be used as a proof of triangle congruence. And I wanted to take a minute to remind you from the previous video, don't forget about cpctc. That is the theorem that says that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That is, if two triangles are shown to be congruent to each other, or given that they are congruent to each other, then all of their corresponding angles and all of their corresponding sides are congruent to each other. So in this video, we did a quick review of the triangle congruence theorems, the ones that do work and that we should be using, the two that don't work and we should not use, and a review of cpctc.